Hello, and a huge warm welcome to my guest today, Stephanie Hammond, who I'm really excited to talk to about all things phonics and literacy. But before we get into that, let me tell you a little more about our guest. Stephanie draws on 25 years of expertise in education, serving as a teaching and learning consultant, DfE Literacy Specialist, NPQLL facilitator, and school experience tutor at the University of Greenwich. Her career centres on empowering practitioners through collaborative teaching, mentoring, coaching, and the delivery of high-quality professional development. Stephanie's enduring passion lies in early language, reading, and writing. I'm so excited to have our chat today. So please, will you welcome Stephanie to the podcast? How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. It's lovely to see you, and I'm excited to have a chat.
Yes, me too. I think phonics and literacy, especially in early years, is something that a lot of people can quite easily get confused at. It can feel overwhelming, especially if you're a parent and you're kind of venturing into this without having any prior experience in learning or teaching the topic. So hopefully we can get some great insights from you today. But to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about your journey in education and kind of what's kept you so passionate about early language and literacy over the past 25 years?
Well, I qualified in the last century, if that helps, 1999, which makes me feel really old. And you saying 25 years makes me feel really old.
I'll stop saying 25 years.
No, it's fine. It's fine. But I think what's kept me committed to education, and in particular early language and literacy, which is kind of the area that I've kind of gravitated towards over the last 20 plus years, is the impact that this early language and literacy can have on children's outcomes, and how we can use, and see children grow in confidence in those areas. I've been really lucky to work with some amazing educators, since I started, really, and their experience and knowledge has really guided me. And I've taken every kind of setting that I've worked in, every school I've worked in, I've kind of always taken a little piece of their practice with me, and it's made me a stronger practitioner, I think. I'm always magpieing ideas and thoughts and inspiration from colleagues. And I guess I know in education, you're never really done, are you? You're never finished. It's a bit like that list of jobs to do that we mentioned, earlier, in terms of, you've always got something that you can improve on and develop. I still get a buzz from talking to children and adults about learning. Like you said, I kind of present and do workshops and things, as well as all the other hats that I have. And from seeing children using just maybe a few words to express themselves, confidently, to then using full sentences, and then eventually using, their words to write sentences, or the development of them as readers. When I've worked in reception, obviously it's amazing to see that they start to recognise what those weird marks and squiggles are that maybe they've seen in Tesco's or on a sign outside, and that suddenly they have meaning because the children have learnt the alphabetic code. So that doesn't ever, that excitement and buzz doesn't ever go. That's something that I'm very driven by, having those outcomes for those children, even if they're very, very small steps.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's so individual that it is acknowledging that some children will get there faster, some children will take a little bit longer, but they'll all get there in their own time. And I love how you touched upon the fact that collaborative working, that kind of you work with one individual and you might take a little bit from your conversation with them, and then you work with somebody else and you take something, and that you're continuously learning as well as, sharing with other people what you know as well. So I love that element of collaboration. I think that happens a lot in education, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think, we're lucky enough to, be able to see each other face to face, but obviously social media and things like that, really widens that networking, or the potential to network beyond. Obviously I'm based within Kent, but beyond Kent, Medway, Sussex, and further afield, we're all doing the same stuff. That's the thing.
That's it, exactly. So you've worked as a teaching and learning consultant, DfE Literacy Specialist, and an NPQLL facilitator. First off, can I ask what an NPQLL facilitator is? And for anyone listening who might not have heard that term, and then how you think that those roles have helped shape how you think about literacy development.
So NPQ is a national professional qualification, and that's in leading literacy. So that's what the LL part means. So that role basically is me working with reading leaders who are primary or secondary based, and basically they complete this NPQ, so they get a qualification, and it really develops their practice and supports them in their leadership role, helps them to reflect on implementing change and what that might look like sort of overall, in a nutshell. But in terms of the kind of the roles that have shaped, you know, how I think about literacy, as I mentioned, I do have a lot of hats. But the key thing is that they're all linked to early language or early literacy, you know, early communication skills. And I think that I've really sort of honed and refined what I already know or what I thought I knew about early language and literacy. So I'm lucky to obviously support teaching assistants and senior leaders and teachers on a sort of day-to-day basis, whether that's through, like you mentioned, training or coaching or facilitating the NPQ. And I think I've always had a strong ethos when it comes to education. I think that was probably instilled in me, you know, when I had my very first kind of experience of going into schools, especially my first school that I worked in was an infant school. And obviously it was very holistic, and there was a very strong ethos about the child being at the centre of everything. So what I think I believe is best practice really was something that I was able to hone, but also having these roles has really allowed me to kind of explore maybe more. I would go on my gut more, and actually now I think you know, I'm really much more about the evidence-based research, and I definitely look at that more thoroughly. Part of that is because as a literacy specialist I run training, and obviously a lot of the training is evidence-based and links to different approaches that have that evidence-base. So I think that for me is something that has shaped me in terms of my practice, and being in school regularly, seeing the challenges that staff are facing, you know, so that I am realistic about how we can make change and how we can support our children. And I guess that realistic part of me people appreciate, because I think they don't want somebody who's coming in going, you know, change this, change that. Like I mentioned earlier, it is about those small steps, and about best practice. You know, what is best practice based on evidence and based on my own experiences, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like music to my ears when you say evidence-based, because as you know, that's something that I feel very passionate about. But I love that you bring in that, like you say, your own experience as well. So it's that lived experience element bringing in to complement what you have found from the evidence, from the research, from, you know, running things and reevaluating them and things like that. So I completely agree with you. I think that's a really powerful combination, bringing those two elements together. And I think you're right. People appreciate that when they're on the receiving end of, you know, training or mentoring or coaching or anything like that. If you can demonstrate that, yes, there's an evidence base and I'm bringing my lived experience into this as well, I think people do really value that as a participant of that. Okay, so I want to jump into phonics, and kind of thinking about, we know that this is important part of early language before formal reading even begins. So why is it important to go to phonics? What can phonics bring to that part of the development?
So I guess before we talk about the phonics part, we almost need to talk about the pre-bit. So, you know, we often, like you said, jump to phonics straight away. People have heard that phrase. They kind of, it's familiar to them. But obviously we need to be aware that pre that more sort of formal reading, we need to be aware of that kind of early language development, and that is essential. I mean, I'm going to talk a bit later on about slowing things down, and I'll kind of leave that thought there for a moment. But firstly, we need to identify what we mean by reading.
Okay.
Are we talking about sharing a book cuddled up with an adult, from being a baby? Or are we talking about a more formal type of reading of having our own book in our book bag, and reading using our decoding skills because of the phonics we've learned? So all of that sort of story sharing from birth or even pre-birth provides us with so much of our attachment that that's so important, and that bonding and that connecting and that cozying up with the story, that is our foundation when it comes to sort of early language and early phonics. So that kind of enjoyment of books, that having an adult's undivided attention, creating that bond. I mean, I'm sure you have, but still got really strong memories of being read to and having books given to me as a child. We've obviously got, with the story sharing comes that early language. So we're going to be using kind of as adults those non-verbal interactions. If you've got babies, you're going to have the smiling and the nodding and the reassurance that comes with that non-verbal language. And then we've got the kind of new vocabulary that we might start to introduce to the children. So, as they start to respond, we know that their comprehension is going to be better than how they speak to start with. So let's not underestimate. I know I have friends who have, little babies, and, they are in education. And so they will read to their babies and see that as an important, connection, an important early language skill. But I know from a friend of mine was saying she asked her husband to read to the baby, and he didn't really know why that was important, and it's really struck with me. And I mean, that baby is probably now 10, but it struck with me that he just couldn't see. Well, why would I do that? Because the baby can't speak, therefore presumably they're not understanding. Why would I do that? So I think let's not underestimate the power of language. And we need to give children, time to practice their speaking and their listening and their responding. And early language is that key to developing that early literacy. So there's lots of layers, before we even launch into, any kind of formal phonics teaching at all.
You're so right, and I've heard this so many times when we talk about reading to very, very young children and babies, and it's because you don't get that reciprocation, isn't it? It's because you can't see that baby is taking in what you're doing, so it feels alien to us as humans, doesn't it? Because we're not getting the response, that kind of I think they call it serve and return, isn't it? You don't get that response from it. And I've spoken to many people, as you have said the same thing, like, but what's the point? Like, they're just a baby, they can't understand. And it's being kind of immersed in that environment of just hearing the noises, hearing the sounds, and it's a great bonding exercise, isn't it?
Yes,
and that's
the key.
close.
That's key, isn't it? We know in terms of their needs, obviously, babies need to be fed and watered, but we also know that love is really important, and that connection is really important. And so let's not underestimate how important that is. And yes, all right, you may not get that reaction, but we've all seen videos with children who are maybe more kind of 18 months, who are a bit more sparky in terms of an obvious reaction. They're pointing to things and you can see their kind of facial expressions. But let's not underestimate, I mean, the neuroscience around stories and the connections between, the sparking of the brain that's going on is really fascinating. So this is not just me going, oh, isn't it a nice idea to do it? This is based in, is based within science, but also it's just such a lovely thing to do, isn't it? A joy to sit and have that time, that quality time together is really important, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And so my daughter's going to be 20 this year. So it was a long time ago that we were reading books together at that very young age. And there's one book in particular that ended up being her favourite book as a young child. But I started reading it really, really young to her. And even now, we chuck the quotes at each other sometimes randomly because it fits in. It was I can't even remember if it was actually called this. I Don't Want to Go to Bed. I think we always refer to it as the book called I Don't Want to Go to Bed. And it was like a cardboard book as well. Like it was just absolutely fantastic. And we will joke around sometimes in the evening, and she'll say something like, "Oh, I don't want to do X, Y, and Z." And I go, "Oh, I don't want to go to bed." And it stuck with us all
Yeah,
these years later. Those, and
absolutely.
it part other books and things like that. So we haven't picked it up since and sat down and read it. But
No.
that kind of quote has stuck with us because it was such a joyful and kind of
Mm,
jokey thing that we did at a young age with that one particular line that, you
yeah.
know, 15 years later we're still
A
saying
hundred,
it.
100%. Exactly. That's a perfect example of how important it is. We
Yeah.
don't need to be flashing flashcards at children. Let's get the joy of reading going. It's really important.
Yeah. So one of the terms that we hear kind of thrown about a lot is language rich environments. What does that actually look like day to day? What does it mean by having a language rich environment?
I mean, it's definitely a phrase that gets talked about within education a lot. It's definitely a phrase that gets talked about within early year settings and within reception classes, and even into Key Stage 1 classes as well. I guess I can tell you what I think it isn't, if that helps.
Okay.
It isn't about having, in my opinion, it isn't about having everything labelled and having keywords displayed everywhere. Firstly, I'm not sure who we're doing that for. I'm assuming it's for the adults to refer to in case they don't, in case they're not using exciting vocabulary on the Play-Doh table, or is it maybe for our senior leaders who are sort of directing early years practitioners to do this, or is it because of visitors to show that we're always thinking about language within early years and, all the time? And yes, look, we're language rich because we've got all this wallpaper up with all these words. And I think it's definitely misguided. It is wallpaper for the children. And, to be fair, I've done it and I'm not sure why I did it. I think I was told to do it, so I just did it. I think there's a much more deep, it's much more deep rooted than that. And, it's a whole setting approach, I would say. So it's about having those, as we mentioned earlier, those quality interactions with our children, that serve and return that you mentioned, that back and forth ping pong of engagement, so that, whether it's non-verbal or verbal, it's about that attention and eventually about having a conversation and getting to a point when you're having that interaction with the children. Although this might appear to be just talking to children, this is something that I would say, and I do lots of work on this sort of approach. It's something that requires you as an educator to be really skilled and to regularly kind of reflect on how you're achieving this. So if you can see the kind of flip side, you've kind of got the classroom, the setting environment is plastered in labels, and then you've got the opposite side of that, which is actually skilled adults interacting with children, providing them with that shared attention, responding to their comments, expanding on the words they say. For example, if a child says, dog, then you might say a fluffy dog. That's your way of supporting them. It's also about the provision. So it's about the provision you have as a sort of a standard, and then the enhancement of that provision that you're making for your children. So it's about your role play spaces, your construction, your puppets, your musical instruments, engaging book areas, having kind of lots of creative materials, your gross motor skills. And you might think, well, how's that supporting, a language rich environment? That's the foundation of it, because obviously if you don't have those enhancements and that provision, then actually how does the talk happen? Where's the talk coming from? So it's about adding resources and removing resources, but also it's about that directed time maybe, and the planning that we make for our children based on their kind of interests. But then it's also about that directed time, like the singing time, the sharing a story, the circle time, the exploring number, being creative or whatever it might be, or developing that knowledge of the world. So it's so much more than labels, if that makes sense. It's so much more than sticking a sign up that says squidge, and roll and pat. It's so much more than that. I know some practitioners introduce, especially in reception classes, will introduce sort of consonant, vowel, consonant words, so CVC words like, like pat, to the children, because then they can read those words. And I think that's something different. I don't necessarily think that means that that's necessarily a language rich environment. But does that make sense in terms of the kind of layers to it? In terms of it, just stick up a few signs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was that practitioner, 10, 15 years ago, putting those labels out and making it. And do you know what? And I feel very strongly about this. And I remember writing an article about this, kind of linked in with this as well, is the pressure on our early years workforce to visibly demonstrate that they are doing certain things. And so I think, in my opinion, a lot of that stuff, I agree with you. I think it's for other people. It's not for the children. It's to demonstrate to visitors, parents who come in, Ofsted when they come in. Yes, we are embracing this. Yes, we are teaching. We are extending our children's vocabulary. So I agree. I think a lot of that is external, and it is more about that kind of internal way of developing our children through things like the conversations, the interactions that we're having, allowing, developing on, as you said, you're a good example around fluffy dog. But it can be overwhelming for our practitioners and our early years staff, because they're under so much pressure to demonstrate and to visibly show, yes, we know that you're doing this, but show us that you're doing it, and having that kind of audit trail of the development. So I suspect that's where a lot of that comes from.
No, I think you're right. But I think it's about the people that are going in and observing, the people that are monitoring, about them understanding what they're looking at. And that might just be that somebody has to say to them, almost like you would if you were, say, I don't know, mentoring or coaching somebody, just whispering in their ear saying, oh, you see what just happened there with so and so and so and so, that's this, because this happened yesterday. I always feel like with early years educators, if you could sort of unscrew your brain and have a look inside, there's so much going on that no one else sees, and that's why, quite often we're exhausted, because we're constantly thinking about, oh, they did that today, oh, they did this yesterday, oh, great, that's really interesting that they've chosen to do that today, or oh, I'm really glad that they've sustained that because I thought they wouldn't, and all of those, there's all that going on. So much going on. So I think it's having the ability to be able to actually unpick that as the person watching and going, talk to me about Jack, talk to me about, tell me about your environment, that kind of thing. I think that, as I said, it's more than sticky labels.
And that was exactly the point that I was making when I wrote this piece, because it was more around the pressure of observation. So as an early years practitioner, when I was working in the nurseries, I really loved the element of observation, observing the children and not stepping in too quickly and disturbing their kind of independent play or their play with their peers. Because if I then went and sat down and got involved, they would instantly look to me to then lead the play, or they would stop with the creativity that they were having, especially when you get to kind of that preschool age group. So I used to stand back and observe a lot. And then that would help me with like thinking about how can I develop this learning, and especially with my own key children, things like that. But when I was firstly qualified, I felt the immense pressure that my managers and my leaders were looking at me going, she's not doing anything. She's just standing there watching. And so going back to what you were saying about the wider people around you and those external people coming in, it's important for them to understand that a lot of this happens intrinsically and enables us to then better develop and plan and things like that for our children. Because if you step in too early, you're just going to break that with the young children. And I found that so many times. And as I got more and more experienced, I got more confidence to say no, this is what I'm doing, and kind of verbalize it. But especially for those newly qualified that feel that pressure. So I think it's very similar to what we were saying there, is having that. And I think you're right. Our early years professionals, their brains are just like constant. Any teaching professional, it's a very heavy job role, isn't it? So
Definitely.
Yeah, I can agree with what you're saying there. Before we move on to phonics and go a bit deeper into that, are there any kind of early signs that you can share with us that may indicate to us that children's language development might need a little bit more support? And how early might these signs come?
Yeah, I think we have to be kind of sensitive about this, because every child is different, and we all know that. So I think we need to understand what maybe typical talk is first. And I mean, when I talk about typical talk, I mean, what is typical for a child who is 4, for example. And then we can use that to sort of recognise if maybe, we know that all children are going to be working at a different sort of pace, and all children are different, and that their rate of progress may differ. But there are documents, and I'm sure, talking to parents here, if you are not sure where to go, then obviously go to the setting and speak to them. But there are documents from Speech and Language UK that you can access, or you can go to the Early Years Foundation Stage Birth to 5 or Development Matters. There are documents that you can access that show you what typical talk might be for a 3-year-old, for example. Then that might help you to sort of understand roughly where your child is sitting. There's another resource called the Communication Chain, which is from Elklan, which is ELKLAN, and they're speech therapists. And they will help you to sort of get an understanding of what we need to do is we need to understand almost like the best fit for the child. So, they might not be doing all of the areas, but actually which ones are the most important that we need to sort of support them with. So you kind of need to understand the child's point of security. Where are they most secure in their language? And I think if you're a parent listening and you're concerned, then obviously you need to talk to your, early years practitioners, and that maybe the early years Senko, there. But if you're a practitioner, then you need to identify the areas that the children might be struggling with. So it could be expressive language, so how they're sharing their ideas, and how they're expressing those ideas, or it could be their receptive language, which is how they're receiving information. So it's kind of input and output, I suppose. So the input would be the receptive language and the output would be the expressive. So that's often, I think sometimes what happens is when we talk about children's language, quite often, or we might say, so-and-so, I think they might, they may be not, at a point of typical talk for their age, but actually we need to really know what that means in terms of, well, is it that they can't, excuse me, that it's their speech that is the issue and that's a challenge for them, or is it that actually they're finding it really difficult to comprehend and follow instructions, for example? So again, that's in its simplest form, that's a good way to kind of understand. I notice when I say to Jack, put your coat on your peg, and then I might say something like, it's the blue peg, and then I might say, or mind your friend as you come as he comes past. Well, I've lost him on the first instruction. Far too many instructions. So does that child always follow their friends and doesn't appear to understand? And do I need to break it down so it's just one instruction at a time? So that's valid for parents and for early years educators as well. But I think, if in doubt, speak to a professional about it. But also, having that subject knowledge and that understanding of what is typical is a really good starting point, because we can all, I understand the anxiety that comes with that, whether it's for an educator or for a parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be other things as well, like hearing problems, is a very common one for affecting children's speech. Obviously, they have to hear sounds to be able to develop that. So some of the more simple things are getting your child's hearing checked and things like that, isn't it? It's so complex, and I can see why it can be overwhelming, especially for parents if they don't have a background in education and learning and teaching and things like that. But also for our early years practitioners as well, they've got lots and lots of children that they're working with. So being able to pinpoint down individually, and that's what I love, the whole key worker thing in our early years settings, because I think that's really important for adults to be able to look deeper into our children, to be able to achieve that every child is individual, because it is impossible to do that with like a class of 30 or 60 or however many you've got. But I can see how it can be easily overwhelming, and obviously being a parent myself, we've all been there. Can you, talking about phonics, I know we touched upon this earlier, so just kind of going a bit deeper into it, can you explain the term pre-phonics as kind of simple as you can for people that may not have heard of it before?
Absolutely. So I guess, there's other words we could use instead of pre-phonics. So you could talk about phonological awareness, which, is a fancy sort of grown-up word. Or we could talk about phonemic awareness. But basically, in a nutshell, what we're talking about here is pre-phonics is what comes before we launch into teaching children letter sounds, basically. So I know that there is often a sense of urgency to kind of people kind of want children to start learning letter sounds. I'm kind of just saying, let's put the brakes on here. So it's about tuning into sounds. And when I talk about sounds here, especially when it comes to pre-phonics, then I'm talking about musical sounds, I'm talking about instrumental sounds, I'm talking about body percussion, I'm talking about environmental sounds. So can your child listen and hear environmental sounds, for example? So if you go out, you walk into the park, can they tell you the difference between the sound? They can hear a bee buzzing, and then they can hear a washing machine as they go out the house. Do they recognise the difference between those two? And can they name those objects, for example? Oh, that's the washing machine buzzing, or that's the bee buzzing. Can they remember the sequence of the objects that they heard? Oh, so when we went out the door, we heard the washing machine, and when we went in the garden, we heard the bee buzzing. So obviously there's loads of language that comes with that as well. The reason we're talking about tuning in is because we want children to be able to listen and attend when they're obviously within their settings and in life. And the reason we want them to be able to kind of remember and recall the sequence is because we want them to be able to then use that kind of memory and recall for later when we are using letter sounds. So if you can remember it was the bee, and then it was the washing machine, and then it was the bus going by, for example, then actually you can remember that when you're spelling the word cat, it is k first, then a, then a t. So it's very literally the pre part. It's about playing around with sounds. So, using voice sounds, hearing the alliteration. So, when things start with the same letter, can they move to the rhythm of songs and rhymes? Do they want to join in with rhymes in books or songs? So in its simplest form is actually not that easy to measure, because there's quite a lot of parts to it. And it doesn't necessarily fit in a neat little box. So there's lots of sort of elements that contribute towards it, which then means that maybe some practitioners or parents may just think, oh, well, I didn't even know that was important to do those things. So those are the kind of that's in a nutshell, really, I guess.
I think it's really important to understand why that's happening, because as you say, people are prone to wanting to rush into things. We're under a lot of pressure. Early years professionals are under a lot of pressure. Parents are under a lot of pressure, and comparison pressure as well with other parents, social media and things like that. So we spend our whole lives trying to rush and achieve things, don't we? Even as an adult, I still do it. I don't spend a lot of time focusing on what I've achieved. I'm like, right, what do I need to do next? So we kind of, as a society, we rush anyway. So I love that you've been able to slow this down for us and bring it back and say, actually, these are the things that we do beforehand, and this is why we do it. This is the skill set that we are preparing our young children for, to then get to that kind of phonics stage. So I think that's really important, and it really kind of aligns and matches up to what I knew previously about kind of pre-writing skills. And before we pick up a pencil, we're doing all of those fine motor skills. We're building the muscles in our hands and that, because it's important for that to happen before we even pick up a writing utensil and try and make a mark. So it's the same sort of thing with the phonics, isn't it? We're understanding all of that beforehand to then go into it. Are there some kind of like playful activities that people can do in the home or in a setting that can help really kind of embellish this stage?
Yeah, I think being playful with sounds and wordplay is a really key part. And I've mentioned, obviously, you can tell I love books, but, you know, books are a great starting point. I think if you're thinking, crikey, you know, where do I start? I don't think I really understand what she's telling me here. I'd say pick up a book is a really good starting point. So quite a lot of the books that you may have at home or in your setting, it's really worth looking at those and seeing what types of books the children are going to. So are they rhyming books? You know, when you look, I mean, even just last week I was doing some training, had a selection of books, and I put stickers on them all saying kind of what areas of pre-phonics they were covering. So rhyming, rhythm, alliteration, voice sounds, animal sounds, whatever it might be. And that for me was really useful, because I could make sure that I was providing my children with quite a nice varied diet. I mean, I'm sure you can already think of books that you know that you are your kind of go-to books. Quite often they'll have a lovely rhythm to them or a lovely kind of rhyming to them. So sharing stories with your children is really important. Talking about the pictures, introducing them to new words, being playful with that kind of rhyming. So, you know, once they've heard the book a few times, pausing and allowing them to join in with that rhyming part, recreating different voices maybe, or different animal sounds in the book. You know, I know that not everybody likes to sing, and I know that, you know, it can make it's one of those things that, you know, I'm definitely conscious that singing, especially in settings, is definitely, you know, not something that is as common maybe as it used to be. I have no evidence for that. It's just on my gut, but not, you know, singing is really important. You know, it doesn't have to be nursery rhymes. Yes, nursery rhymes are amazing, and, you know, they give the children a lot of those pre-phonics kind of rhyming skills. You know, the fact that, you know, it's a cat, and then it's a bat, and then it's fat. You know, the children start to tune into that rhyming. It's really important. But there's lots of kind of resources out there. You know, listen to the radio, put, you know, your Spotify on, whatever it is. Pop songs are fine. Getting the children moving their bodies and joining in, clapping, that kind of thing. You know, if you're stuck, as I said, there's lots of resources online, and there's a lot of research into the link between obviously songs and memory. You know, and it always blows my mind, you know, how children can learn sort of 10 songs at Christmas for the Christmas performance. It's like, how do they do that? I mean, and the adults are there with the, you know, the crib sheet trying to read it, and the children just know it straight away, don't they?
Yeah.
So playing along to the beat of a song, so clapping or tapping, or having maybe a stick or a spoon to join in, even if they're out of the beat, it doesn't matter. It's just about that fun joining in, tuning in with what you can hear. So when you're on a walk, identifying the difference in the sounds, as we mentioned, and then also talking about those. So like I said, you know, helping them to recall what they'd seen. So, you know, when you're on a car journey, or you're walking to the shops, or you're going to the park, you know, we saw a red bus, then we saw a man up a ladder, and then the children on the swings, you know, and that conversation, you might think, well, how's that phonics? But that is pre-phonics. That is a big part of that kind of skill set. So there's kind of lots there. But again, it's not necessarily kind of neat and tidy. But I think, you know, I think it is about really important to get those kind of areas of tuning in and listening, really important, listening and attention, you know, even for 30 seconds. You know, you will find that a child will join in with a song, but they might not necessarily, you know, and they'll stand up and they'll clap and they'll dance about, but they find it really difficult to sustain concentration sitting. So actually, they're still learning that way. Doing that remembering and that recall is really important. And then also introducing that new vocabulary. So whether it is, you know, a bee or a washing machine or a motorbike, you know, using that vocabulary oh, where would you find a motorbike? Oh, we normally find it on the road, or we might find it outside our house. That is also pre-phonics. So you can see kind of how some people might find it a little bit more fluffy and not easy to know where to start, opposed to phonics, which is, you start here and you go from A to B sort of thing.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. It's kind of, it's not, it can be, there is a progression that you can follow. But again, when I'm just talking about it today, it might seem a bit more fluffy than perhaps, some people like, if that makes sense. People like structure, don't they? So.
Yeah, I think this is a really important aspect to talk about. And I love that you've given the examples that you have, because it just goes to show for those people who may be a bit anxious around, oh, I don't have any teaching experience, I don't know how to put together a lesson plan, I don't know how to plan an activity to get the right outcomes, and all of these words that we hear associated with teaching and learning. And actually, what you've just spoken about there are just everyday things that parents are doing already. Yeah. And I think that's really reassuring to hear, that actually probably 99% of the day that you're spending with your young person, you are doing all of these things naturally anyway. It just doesn't have the pre-phonics stamp on it to tell you that's what you're doing.
And I guess that's about that idea of sort of knowledge is power, isn't it? So once you know that so you've listened to the podcast, you've heard the ideas that I've just shared, that then would make you more sort of, you would almost tune in more. So, when you are walking to the park and your child's got the stick and they're running it along the banister, the railings, they're tuning in, that is pre-phonics. But actually, it's about having that awareness, isn't it? If you have an awareness of it, then maybe you might do more of that. You might concentrate on that a little bit more. You might think about that a bit more and be more conscious of it, I guess. That's like you said, because quite often we're doing it sort of unconsciously. Music might be on in the background all the time. You might be singing along in the car, whatever it might be. But actually having an awareness that is a really important foundational skill. Well done, you, is all I can say. If you're doing it, great, keep on doing it.
Exactly that. So thinking about phonics itself, and thinking it a bit more contextually in terms of when teachers are then going on to teach phonics, and there is often a lot of debate around this, and there are different types of phonics programs, aren't there? And I remember being in one setting and they used this particular program of phonics, and then I moved settings and it was a completely different phonics program. So there's a lot going on. Is there kind of an overall effective way of teaching phonics? Like, what does this look like? Are there key things that kind of go across the board, all of them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky that I go to schools, like I said, a lot. And as a literacy specialist, I have schools that are using a variety of different phonics programs that have been validated by the DfE. But there are kind of some key threads that run through. Obviously, we have messages from documents like the reading framework that kind of gives guidance in terms of what phonics should look like. And I guess when it comes to this, it kind of, in a nutshell, it's about consistency, and it's about being quite systematic when it comes to teaching. Teachers are, constantly using their knowledge of the children to assess them. So in the moment, during a phonics lesson, a big part of, good practice would be to, checking on the children, to check that they understand, who's confident with that new letter sound, who might be struggling. Obviously, you'll do more summative kind of like end of unit assessments, but actually that constant checking in during the day. Let's not wait, 3 weeks, 6 weeks until we do something about it. So teachers would use that information to inform their kind of next steps or their next lesson. They might catch the child or the children later in the day if they particularly need to practice a letter sound. There is, with majority of phonics programs, there's a really clear progression of letter sounds that means that children can start to build words quickly, and I think that is really powerful. So in terms of so we're saying consistency, being systematic, using kind of ongoing assessment, having that clear progression. In the schools that I visit, phonics is taught daily and sometimes twice a day in some settings. The lesson structure is the same. So, obviously for your particular phonics program you're using, generally the structure is the same or similar. The new letter sound is the only new thing that is introduced. It's important. It might sound dull, but actually it's important to keep the lesson the same so that the children don't have to focus on too many new things. Children love predictability. We know that. So do a lot of adults in terms of lesson structure. So it means that children are only focused in on that letter sound. They don't have to think, oh, what comes next? What comes next? It's not a surprise. The phrase kind of cognitive overload is used to describe children who might be tuning out because they can't take on board any new information. So that's why we're kind of streamlining the phonics lesson. So, it's very familiar. We always do this, then we always do this, then we always do this, because then the new letter sound is the bit that their working memory is going to focus in on. So within a phonics lesson, children are going to be asked to kind of recall maybe previous letter sounds that they've been introduced to. They'll be introduced to a new letter sound. They'll be encouraged to word build, and often that's done orally. So it's called oral segmenting and blending. So, for example, the adult might say shark, and then the children would say shark, or they would say shark, right. Shark. So that is a part of pre-phonics. So they don't necessarily see the letter sounds for it. It's about orally tuning in. So that's kind of the last part of pre-phonics, really. But lots of phonics programs have now seen the importance of that, so that some children still find that quite difficult. So they've incorporated that into their kind of introduction to phonics. Children then supported when it comes to segmenting and blending, given a chance to practice that skill. And then the lesson would also include things like tricky words or common exception words, which is always those things that can catch children out. So that's things like the word said. So obviously, if you're going to sound that out, it will be said. So the child needs to know that the A and I makes an d. So it's making the sound. And then that will support them. And then generally, at the end of a phonics program, there's some form of either reading a sentence or a caption, which has that letter sound in, or the children are then asked or encouraged to have a go at writing a word or words using those skills. So, there are obviously, I don't know how many, there's a lot of validated phonics programs, but generally that's the gist of what, we expect children to segment and blend. We're expecting them to be able to read, having a go at reading sentences. Obviously, this is all supported, but this is something that they're used to the routine. This is familiar to them.
So are there any misconceptions that you commonly see around kind of phonics or early reading instruction?
I guess the quick response to that question is that people might assume that it's natural to learn to read, like it is natural to learn to speak or walk, and that it will come from being exposed to lots and lots of books and reading around them. But it isn't natural to read. It's obviously kind of a man-made creation, and it means, it's a code. And we need to make sure that we're supporting children to crack that code and to be able to sort of tune into that code. So in terms of, it isn't natural. It needs to be taught, obviously in the way that I've described. When children are asked to read a kind of a decodable book, which would be your kind of, some schools might call it your phonic book or something like that. That's one that's going to allow them to practice their phonics knowledge. This is not necessarily going to be a book that you can talk about lots, about the story with the child and get lots out of. This is a book created to practice the process of reading. So again, in terms of misconceptions, parents may, I know schools work really hard at sharing with parents, what the books are and why we do what we do, and what the purpose of them are. But I think you can get your book bag comes home, you have one book that's a decodable book, and you're thinking, okay, I've got to teach my children to read this. Then you might have another book that's maybe from the book area that the child might call a sharing book or a take home or a reading for pleasure book or something like that. But again, it's that misconception. Which one? So am I reading both of these with my child, or am I reading none of these with my child? Am I supposed to help them? Am I not supposed to help them? So I think those misconceptions are really common. I mean, the key really is particularly around phonics books, is that children have to move really quickly through a scheme. So when I was in school, when I first started teaching, we were probably changing the children's sort of decodable book like almost every day, every other day it was changed. So like, oh yes, they've read it at home overnight, right, new book. There's definitely a shift in the last couple of years, and it's much more now about getting the child to practice. So thinking about, so for example, some phonics programs, they will have early reading as a big part of their phonics program. So the child will read a book over a week. So they actually repeatedly read the book. Now, I know lots of parents find that really frustrating, but the reason we do that, and the reason there's a shift from that to changing books every day or every other day, is because we want them to practice the skill of reading. So they need to build up their fluency, basically, so they can read it with increased fluency and confidence. So ultimately, what you're hoping is that when that, as a teacher, when that book, I've read it 3 times with my children, when it goes home, the adult doesn't need to help the child read it. The child is just going to practice reading it with fluency to the adult. I think some parents find that really weird, like, well, they can read it. Why are they reading it again? But it is really important that children see themselves as readers, and that we're not giving them a book that they have to really struggle with. So initially, you might on the Monday have that decodable book with your child, that phonics book, and they may find that they do stumble over a few bits and pieces along the way. But by the time you've read it 3 times, they'll kind of get the gist, don't they, better? So by the time they then read it at home, they're more confident. So in theory, the parent then doesn't need to do very much apart from listen to the child read it and give that encouragement. What they then do need to do is, this is where all the kind of early language comes in, which is the sharing the book of, the reading for pleasure book or the story book or whatever it might be. The book the child can't read, you need to be reading with them. And that's where you get that kind of enjoyment from. And that's where you get all that language. And obviously we've talked about the bonding and everything that comes with that. So those are the kind of common misconceptions that often as a teacher I'm aware of, and I recognise the kind of confusion and the shift that's happened over the last sort of 5 years or so in terms of parents going, but they've read this already in class, so why are they reading me? I mean, I think if you're worried, then have some of, speak to the school, and if you need to have some decodables at home that you want to share with them, that's fine. But again, it is also about that idea of us pushing. Let's just focus on the book that we've got for school. And the children are tired when they come home. Actually, sometimes, that's a struggle in itself, isn't it? Even getting them to read a page, let alone, reading the whole book. So at least they've done that at school, have had that experience at school. So I think that's
and I think touching on what you've just said there is the importance of saying, if you're not sure, go and speak to the school, speak to your child's teacher, because I think a lot of what we've just heard there is just the parent not knowing and not understanding the process or the whys. Like we said earlier, it's knowing why you're doing something, and then you can understand it more, and it will relieve some of that anxiety around, oh, my child has already read this, you're not moving them on, they're getting left behind and all things like that. It's understanding, actually, this is a process and this is what we're engaging in. And I think as well, like you said, over the last 5+ years, this has changed. And you think about parents that have older children that may have experienced something differently with them, and then all of a sudden with their next child, oh, but this isn't how it used to be. But we don't understand, us parents, we're not in that field. We're not hearing about these updates and these changes. We're not hearing the rationale and the justification behind why these things have changes. We're probably not even reading the research that has informed those changes. So it's understandable that we would feel anxious as parents because we just want our children to thrive. So I think the key bit of that for me that I've taken from that is the understanding, the knowing behind why it is happening. And if you don't know that, ask the teachers.
And quite often schools and sort of settings, they have quite good websites. So, quite often you'll go into the website and you can go to the phonics section and it will say, this is what reading looks like in our school. This is why we do what we do.
Okay.
So again, it's sort of signposting people to, yes, obviously talk to, the class teacher, but also be aware that actually the information is out there. If you find out what the phonics program is, you can probably go into their website. They generally will have a parent section that you can dip into and have a look.
Okay.
So again, it's just like you said, it's that having that understanding. And definitely, you know, I'm very aware that, you know, if you've got a family of 3, you could very well be on your last child, you know, in reception. Your older children are in key stage 2 or secondary. And it is different. And it's like, well, that's not how we did it before. And having that shift is quite a challenge, I think, sort of, you know, in terms of, well, what's the why? Why are we not doing it like we did it before? So, but, you know, but you will reap the rewards because you'll hear your children reading is what's so lovely.
Yeah, and what might be helpful is you said there about the websites for the different phonics programs and that. I might put some links underneath the episode to some of these different websites, and so parents can have a little explore and find them a bit easier. So that's a great tip. Thank you for sharing that. So you work with practitioners a lot as well, and we touched upon a moment ago about building confidence in our children with reading, and part of their kind of developing along that way is gaining confidence in themselves and seeing themselves as readers. What have you found in your work that you've done with practitioners that teachers most need when it comes to building their confidence in early literacy?
I think based on what we mentioned at the very beginning, actually, it's about having an understanding of the why it's important for early years educators. So we often undertake practice because we're told to do it, because we've always done it that way, because we don't really know why. You know, we just do it because we do it. So sometimes going back to the why can really help us understand. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater at all, but I'm saying what tweaks we might need to make to our kind of day-to-day practice or our day-to-day early literacy practice. You know, as I said, I don't mean you've got to get rid of everything, you know, tweaks, small steps, but viewing the latest kind of evidence-based research can be a really good starting point. And then, you know, when I've seen really impactful change happening within a setting or a school, quite often it has a really strong evidence base. And then that's their starting point. And then comes CPD comes with that. So that professional development, that training, those workshops, that continues, you know, rather than it just being a snapshot, but over time you continue to have your professional development, and that will help to kind of clarify the thinking on the intention of your practice, the kind of why you're doing it, and then you can start planning your next steps and continue to kind of review and, you know, what impact is it having? Oh, that didn't quite work, but actually why didn't it work? Quite often the reason things don't work is because we think we're implementing them really sort of rigorously, but in actual fact, oh, well, we didn't do it on that day, and oh, that happened because, you know, and then you suddenly realize that what you think is quite kind of like really powerful change is a bit of a, you know, as a sort of fallen a bit flat, because actually not everybody's on board. So there's lots of layers when it comes to sort of implementing change, but I think the understanding why you're doing what you're doing, the stepping back and going, well, why do we always let parents in at that time? Or why do we always shut off the sandpit at that point? Or, you know, whatever it might be, why are we doing that? Having somebody who's that kind of why person going, why have we done it? Like, you know, because often it's a fresh pair of eyes, isn't it? Somebody coming in, looking, going, tell me more about the kind of reasoning for that. And then often people can't actually, oh, I don't know. Well, we've always done it like that, you know? So I think we mentioned earlier, you know, you're constantly reflecting and reviewing and changing and tweaking as you know, as a practitioner anyway, which makes, you know, you stronger. But I think it is important to just work out why. I mean, there's lots of layers to that kind of question, I guess.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our practitioners almost work on autopilot sometimes because everything 100%. Is so structured and they know what's expected of them. There are lots of frameworks and guidelines and expectations within settings and things like that. So you do kind of work through. I remember years ago when I worked in nursery, and it's like, right, we're going to start with this, and then it's going to be that time to do that. Then it's going to be snack time. Then it's going to be that. And you do end up being pretty much on autopilot. So I think encouraging that moment to step back, reflect and say, right, why am I doing it like this? can it be changed? Can it be refined? If it can, what do we do? If it can't, why can't it? What benefits am I taking from this? So again, and this is like a recurring theme throughout our conversation, it's that slowing down, isn't it? It's taking a moment, stepping back and reflecting is really, really important. And actually, as a field, education professionals are really good at reflection, I think, in my opinion.
Definitely. Yeah,
we're really good at reflecting. So I just want to close with a couple of questions. First off, around our parents and those parents who may be worrying and anxious that their child is behind, especially in this kind of early reading literacy element. What kind of reassurance can you offer parents navigating this worry at the moment?
I think I'm hoping that what I've talked about so far is going to make people feel a bit more confident about what early reading or early language literacy, however you want to phrase it, might look like.
Yeah.
But I also, how you can support your child at home. I know parents worry because their child doesn't want to read at home, or they, it can make learning at home quite stressful. And I think I've always said to my parents, when I talk to them and they're tackling that kind of challenge, I've always said, just back off. It's okay, because actually, we don't want the child to hate learning. They're doing a lot of it day to day in the classroom. So I think conversations with early years practitioners or with teachers would be the first step. If you're concerned, then ask. If you don't feel like you're getting where you need to get to, then perhaps ask to have a conversation with the Senko and the class teacher. I think it's about, you can go and present your concerns, but I think that, can the school show you what stage of learning that your child is at in terms of perhaps early reading? What do they need to do next in their learning? Schools will have some form of assessment. They'll have their ongoing assessments and their monitoring, but they'll also have maybe sort of end of placement or kind of baseline assessments in terms of, gauging the stage of development. So if your child is developing, not at a typical stage of development for reading, then ask the school what they're doing about it and then what you can do about it. I think there are many factors that can make a child not on track, if that makes sense. And I think one of the things to hold on to is that this doesn't mean that this is something that they will always find difficult. I've talked to colleagues in the past, and a lot of my colleagues that I have worked with have actually, can remember a time when they were getting additional support as a child in their school. And, they're now literacy specialists or head teachers or whatever. So I think it doesn't mean this is forever. Obviously, it depends on, if there's a form of diagnosis there, then obviously that's another factor. But, make another date as well. So you might see the Senko and the class teacher, but then make another date there and then to come back to this. So you might have incidental conversations on the door or the gate, but actually let's come back to this. And then you've got a date in your diary, that you're going to review this, and, you'll get those regular updates, and the progress and the steps might be small, but actually it's showing that they're being made and how they're being measured. So I think, it's really important to share your concerns, ask the school where they feel your child is, and then getting those kind of, don't just do one meeting and then leave it because you'll worry. So make another date in the next term, come back to it, and get those regular kind of updates. And what can you do to help? What things can you do? I think that's really, you'll feel more in control then if you can have a bit of, you can then go back and say, oh, I did this with Jack and this is what happened, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice, and something that many parents sometimes feel a bit anxious about doing and approaching, and taking up teachers' time. We are told a lot of the time when it comes to this kind of comparison and that you're overthinking it, you're just being an overly anxious parent, things like that. So it's nice to hear that actually our teachers do want to talk to us and they do want to share these things with us, and it's just about carving out the right time to have those conversations. And actually, as you say, putting that time in the diary so that is protected time to sit and discuss when there aren't other things competing for anyone's attention.
It's really difficult. It's difficult, if you've got a class of 30 children, they're all exiting the class, checking thinking everyone's going with the adults they should be going with, and then a parent comes to talk to you about something really important, I don't want to say to that parent, I can't talk to you right now because I've got to check that everyone is going home safely. You don't want to come across as rude, but also it's really not the right time to have that conversation as well. So that's why I sort of would make that recommendation of kind of planning it a little bit more systematically to make sure that actually that person, you know, the Senko's coming together, the class teacher's brain is in the right place because they know they're talking about Jack, you know, all of those is kind of the perfect sort of, you know, scenario really, rather than that catching 5 seconds here, there, because then also the teacher might say something that then the adult then takes away and then overthinks, you know, and actually that's not what the teacher meant, you know, and it's so easy for things like that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And as an overthinker myself, I can vouch for that. That does happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about our early years workforce and our practitioners? Thinking about what we've discussed today, what would you like them to come away from our conversation today knowing and understanding more about early literacy?
I guess I would want sort of parents and educators to recognise that early literacy is about the foundations of speaking and listening and reading and writing. So I really strongly believe, and I hope that's come across during the session, that, you know, it's really important to recognise that it's not a race to get to reading using phonics or writing words. Okay. Yes, I'm very aware of what, you know, typically children should be working on and where they should be. But I think that we need to use those sort of markers of success so that we can see them in action. So we kind of need to be thinking about those pre-skills, layering those. You know, as a teacher, I see children that don't have those pre-phonics skills. I see those children that maybe haven't had those, you know, attention and listening skills, you know, sort of shared with them when they come into a reception class. So I think all of those early literacy skills that I've mentioned earlier are not as easy to measure necessarily or prescribe. You know, I can do you a whole session on activities and games and, you know, provide you with a structure. But in the snapshot that's today, I think it is quite hard to measure. And I think phonics or writing, for example, are easier to measure. You know, you've got a outcome. You can go, oh, I know that child is writing because this is their piece of writing. I know that this child is their phonics is working and they've got the alphabetic code because they're reading this level of book. Whereas actually the pre-phonics, the speaking, the listening, the reading, the pre-reading, the pre-writing, like you said about the motor skills and stuff like that, it's not as easy to measure. But I think what we need to remember is that, you know, those pre-skills are essential for that future success to be a reader, to be a writer. If you've got those foundational skills, then that will make, you know, that will put the child in good stead, basically.
Yeah. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us today. Your insights on this has been incredibly inspiring and reassuring. And as someone who has both worked in education and is a parent myself, I can see that there is value from our conversation for both of these types of people. So thank you. Really, really appreciate it. If people want to get into contact with you, are there good routes via email, website? Are you on social media?
Yeah, so I guess we'll pop some bits at the bottom in terms of links. But yeah, if you just search for Hammond Education, you'll find me on social media. If you look up my website, it's Hammond Education. You can contact me that way. So yeah, I'm happy to chat with people more if they'd like to know more information.
Amazing, thank you. As we said, we'll pop all of those links on underneath and people can reach out as and when they want to. But thank you so much. It's been absolutely brilliant speaking with you today, and thank you for sharing such wonderful insights.